We're talking about core values. Sean is leading us through a series on core values, what our church's core values are, and what that looks like biblically. He has asked me this week to preach on depending on God. So I'm going to do that, okay? Before you start, I got to give you a visual, though. All this stuff's going on this morning, right? And you all know John Lehman, right? So John and I are out front trying to greet people, putting a headset on, my shirt untucked. It was quite a scene to start with, and I thought, how is this going to work, right? It was a little chaotic this morning, so I would pray that you guys would pray for me to have a calm spirit as we go into the Word. Core value of depending on God. Let's just talk a little bit about that. Does everybody have a bulletin by chance, or most people? I'm hoping that you do, okay? So, core value, depending on God. If we were to say that, it's a church, a community known as a people dependent on God, making God known. A church, a community of people dependent upon God and making God known. Okay? So I want you to hear that. Now, if you've got the bulletin, here's what I want to ask you to do. I'm going to read something to you. And when I read it to you, I'd like you to follow along in the bulletin, because I think it's important to understand what the core value is going to look like, right? Depending on God, we desire to be a church that relies on God for His work to be done and for His fruit to be produced in us. We realize that a life transformed by the gospel is through God's power, not our abilities. We also realize that all good things come from God, and that we as men, women, and children can take responsibility for what God has already done, or what God has really done. So, we strive to be a church that not just talks about faith, but lives in faith to our great God. We want to be a church where God's power is experienced and embraced. We know that we don't always live a faithful life, but repent when we fail and allow God to heal and restore our lives. We want people to experience the incredible power of the love of God in their personal lives. This is only done when we let God do His work through us. We know that we need God to work for the mission of the church to be successful. However, we also know that we will not experience a life of freedom without placing everything in the hands of God. Jesus modeled a life of dependency on God. We hope to be a church pleasing to God, which is only done in faith toward God. We want to be a church that gets out of God's way and allows God to do His work using our family. I hope you read that. And I hope you'll think through that. When this comes out on our website, there'll be a series of questions before it. Okay? Sean wrote these questions, and as you guys know, Sean's much better at words than I am. That's why I only preach about 2 or 3 times a year, because he's better with words than I am, and he can get a point across very, very well. But he does give some great questions here, but the one that stands out is, what if the church viewed the word faith as being total dependency on God and taught its people to live the same way individually? So what if we viewed faith as total dependence on God? We live that individually. We live that corporately, and then we taught people to live that way individually. Living in faith, totally dependent on God. He's in control. He's sovereign. He's got it. What would we look like? Good rhetorical question, maybe not rhetorical, right? In Hebrews 11, we see now faith is a reality of what is hoped for and the proof of what is not seen. Okay, faith is just really, if you want to... You read that definition out of Hebrews 11:1, and then you talk about faith. Faith really, to me, is really dependence on God is that faith in action. Our American vocabulary kind of leads us down that path. It's really easy to say, what's faith? We quote Hebrews 11:1. But what becomes really reality to us is when we're really depending on God and He works and we see those results and He gets glorified, that's kind of faith in action. So dependence really is kind of action of that faith, if you were to ask me. Dependence really, if you go to Webster's, it means to rely on, to trust. It means to be dependent means nothing more than to rely on someone or something else to meet your need. That's all dependence means at that point. Pretty straightforward, really. Now, the question then becomes to you guys, right? And me, I'm sorry. I've been studying for 4 or 5 days, so I've been asking this question a lot, right? Do I depend on God? Am I dependent? Do I trust Him? Do I practically live that out or not? In my individuality of doing that, does that then transpose into a corporate body of believers that is demonstrating a dependence on God? I can give you some answers that are pretty cool. Sean gave us a vision for Thrill on the Hill. There's some thoughts around that. Maybe some of you agreed or disagreed. I don't know. I don't need to know. All right? But we got some significant donations and things became available to us where we could do it. The purpose of that is to reach our community and little kids, medium kids, for the gospel. It's pretty cool to me. We laid it out there. We prayed about it. And God's given us some provision. Dave, you may need to correct me, you or Jim, but just a few weeks ago, it was 4 or 5 people going to the DR? 9. Some funding has been met, but oh, by the way, there's still funding to be met, right? Pretty cool. Got folks going to India. God's providing there. One of the interesting things about dependence on God, you know, when you see folks like Larry Hart and Melanie Hart leave, right, you get anxious. I do. Larry's that elder I go to, and like, Larry, you know, how do you be calm, right? How do you deal with this or that and all these other things, right? And then you think, oh, they're leaving. We'll never be the same. Well, as Larry and Melanie have left, we've had new people come. God provides. If we're dependent on Him, He'll meet our needs. And not only will He meet our needs, but He'll advance His kingdom in that dependency, which ultimately is what needs to be happening in our lives, individually and corporately. Okay? So, there's a great Bible story about this, right? And it's very, very familiar. Okay? It's out of Exodus. It's Moses, him at the burning bush, and then him leading the Israelites to the wilderness. So when we read verses, I guess that's time you can take a nap because you all know it, right? Or maybe you've gone into the deep theology visual illustration of the Prince of Egypt and watched it. I don't know. I like the Prince of Egypt. Maybe it's my simplistic mind. But I caught it, okay? It was a good show. You guys are not catching any humor today. You got to loosen up a little bit. You give a guy a real self-complex up here if you just look at me when I make a joke about Prince of Egypt and getting it, okay? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about Moses at the burning bush, getting called by God to go lead the people out of Israel, or out of Egypt, okay? And I want to talk about how he individually had to depend on God. And then I want you to see how the Israelites, as they were traveling through the wilderness, had to learn to depend on God too. And how did they do that or did they not do that? All right, there's some really good examples in that. Really good examples. Okay? If you guys can just hang with me here. I'm going to read a few verses. It may take a little longer than you like. Okay? But I think Eric is going to put them up on the screen. Just hang with me. I'll try to get through them real fast. Just so you know, you're not in any danger of losing any time today. Okay? We're going to some very dear friend's house after church. They're making us hamburgers. They're grilling them out. I can't be late or I won't eat. Okay? So you guys don't have to worry. Just hang in here with me. We're going to read a few verses, have a little bit of an application. I hope you're challenged individually to walk away from here knowing, you know what, I got to depend on God in my individual life for the things that He's doing in my life, both positive and negative. And in that independence, or in that dependence on God, that's going to transpose into a corporate dependence. Where all of a sudden, Faith Lakeside on the hill won't be, oh yeah, that church on Water Dam. I want it to be that place that truly shows Jesus to Peters Township. We got some cool things going on. We got a guy who works in Starbucks that invites more people to church than I do in 6 months. What's wrong with me? Right? So we need to be that people. As we're dependent on Him, God will reveal that in our community. Okay? Exodus chapter 3. Let's start there. All right, Exodus chapter 3. Where I'm going to start is verse 9, and I'm going to read through 15. And we're going to get going. If I can find verse 9. It's right after all the names I didn't want to read out loud and have you guys make more fun of me, because those names were not in the Prince of Egypt, okay? Yeah, thanks for laughing. I appreciate that. The Israelites cry for help. Let me try again. The Israelites cry for help has come to me. The Israelites' cry for help has come to me. This is God speaking, okay? Let me give a little background here. That was bad. Rewind. Let me back up a little bit. Moses is at the burning bush. Moses grew up in Egypt, okay? He was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, okay? He was trained as an Egyptian. Through certain events that I won't go through, he murdered somebody. And he murdered somebody, he fled from Egypt. And he lived in Midian, in the desert. He wound up becoming a shepherd for his father-in-law. That's what he wound up doing. Estimates are he left Egypt somewhere around 40. He spent 40 years in the desert as a shepherd. He's 80 years old now. 80 years old, at the burning bush as a shepherd. The bush is burning, it's not being consumed, it's quite a sight. Okay. By the way, you need to know, this isn't mythology. This happened. Okay? God's word says it, it happened. So don't try to educate that away, just accept it. Bush is on fire, it's not getting consumed, it's intriguing, he goes to it. God says, hey, stop, you're on holy ground. Take off your sandals. By the way, this is God speaking to you, the father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Get your attention? Should. You guys are quiet, so I'm going to assume it did. Okay? So now God's talking to Moses, and here's what he says in verse 9 when I try again. The Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses asked God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He answered, I will certainly be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God on the mountain. Then Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? He says, God replied to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the Israelites. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. You want to know if God's word's real and if it's true? It's 2015. We just referred to him to I am, the God, the Father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He said in here that that's how he will be known. And we're still saying it. It's true. It doesn't change. Okay? What happens here? Let's talk about this just for a minute. Moses really does demonstrate independence on God individually. He really does. And we like to get critical of Bible characters. You ever notice that? We get critical of Peter running his mouth. Right? We get critical of David and his philandering. If you really studied the life of Moses, you would see Moses had a temper. And you would become critical of him at some point in time. Right? Well, guess what, y'all? You're just like him. Right? I got enough Peter in me to really be stupid. Okay? And that's just the truth. So don't be critical of them and don't get too hung up on the questions. But I want you to hear his questions. He questions God. He says, who am I to go to Pharaoh? Who am I? Right? He also, a little bit later, he says, who should I say sent me? You see the doubt in there? You see the concern? What's going to happen? I'm going to go tell these people, and they're going to look at me and say, "What? Who are you? Who sent you? What's up with you?" Okay? God gives him some promises, though. Promises, assurances, and grace. He says he promises to be with Moses. He promises to deliver his people out of misery. He said he heard their cries. He said, "I'm going to deliver them." Not only does he say, "I'm going to deliver them," but he says, "I'm going to give them a land with space, full of milk and honey." That's what he tells them, right? Now, if you were to go on in chapter 4, right, and I won't read all these verses to you, but chapter 4, verse 1 says, and there's some dialogue here where Moses and God go back and forth, where he assemble the elders and he gives some instruction. You get to verse 4 or chapter 4, verse 1. He says, "Then Moses answered God, and he says, 'What if they won't believe me and will not obey me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you?'" Then the Lord, you guys remember this, either Charlton Heston if you're over 50 like me, or Prince of Egypt if you got kids, or somewhere in between, right? He says, "What's that you got in your hand?" "You got a staff. Throw it on the ground." He throws it on the ground. What happens to it? Snake. You guys can talk. Snake. He does this in front of Moses. And then what does Moses do? You guys remember the story? God says, "Pick it up." He says, "Pick it up where?" By the what? Tail. Okay, so I'm gonna go full self-disclosure. Snakes scare me to death. Seriously. I mean, my son is now 21. His senior year when he was here, we had like 3 garter snakes out in the front yard. I jumped up and down and squealed like a little girl, said, "Go kill him." He has his moments too, but I won't embarrass him. I'll just embarrass me. And he could handle that, right? I remember when he lived in Georgia, we had a snake in the pool one time. I said, "I can't get that." I had a net with a 6-foot pole on it, right? I can't get that, man. Stephen goes and grabs it out of the pool by the head, takes it, goes down and gets rid of it. These hands at 51 have never touched a snake. Not in a zoo, not dead. Okay? Snakes scare me to death. But God demonstrated his power to Moses by saying, "Throw it on the ground, turn it into a snake, and then pick it up by its tail." Moses did it. That second question, right? After that, Moses still has doubt. He says, "Take your hand and put it in your robe." So he does. You guys remember this part? Pulls it out. What's on it? Leprosy. Right. My translation says disease. So let's put it back in. Puts it back in. Takes it back out. It's healed. Moses had questions, and God demonstrated his power. Okay? By the way, Moses doesn't have a hold on this. He'll do the same thing for you. He will. Trust me. Then Moses talks about he's never been eloquent in speech, right? Verse 10, if you read that, "But Moses replied to the Lord, 'Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, either in the past or recently, or since you have been speaking to your servant, because I am slow and hesitant in speech.'" You know, one of the greatest missionaries of all time was not a good speaker. Study the life of Paul. He had to depend on God. Funny thing, isn't it? But much of the New Testament is written by the Apostle Paul. And when he preached, people got saved. Thank God we're not dependent on eloquent speech. But God, amen for me especially, whoever said that. But God gave him a promise. God said, I tell you what, I'll teach you. Moses goes on a little bit later in the story, and then he says, "Lord, please send someone else. Please?" Then the Lord's anger burned. The Lord said, "I'm sending Aaron. In fact, Aaron's already on his way. You're going." Best Uncle Jim, who comes to stay with us quite frequently in this through the year for weeks at a time, has a phrase that I kind of, as I was studying this morning, I thought of him when I read this again. Uncle Jim gets to a point where he's done talking about it, and Uncle Jim says, "That's all I got to say about that." I think when the Lord's anger burned, the Lord said, this is all I've got to say about this. You're going to Pharaoh. And then if you get to verse 1 of chapter 5, guess who's standing in front of Pharaoh? Moses and Aaron. Then you guys know the story, right? There's plagues that come. 7 plagues. And at every turn, right? Every turn. No, they're not going to go. In fact, there's a couple times in there, okay, I'll let them go. Then they get ready to go, boop. Pharaoh changes his mind. It wasn't until the last plague, right? You Bible scholars can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the last plague when his son died, Pharaoh's son died. Then that was it. That was the end. All right, get him out of here. Go. I can't take this anymore. And then the Passover came. That's a whole other sermon. Again, we're talking about dependency on God. Individual dependency found in Moses. Now let's talk about some corporate dependency. How did the people respond? So where's the first obstacle? Here's a participation question. Again, you can talk. What was their first major obstacle once they left? Red Sea. Absolutely. So let's go over. How am I on time? I'm okay. Okay. I want to go to Exodus. You guys still with me? Are you bored? No, you're just being polite because you're in church. Exodus 14, right? Escape through the Red Sea. So now we're talking about what happens when these guys are stretched a little bit and they got to depend on the Lord for deliverance. If you were to read Exodus 14, 29 through 31, it kind of summarizes really what happened here. And it's a good way to intro this topic from a surveying kind of way instead of an exegetical break down each verse, go through it word by word kind of thing. In verse 29, he says, "But the Israelites had walked through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the power of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and believed in him and in his servant Moses." What's interesting, though, if you were to jump up a few verses, all right, and I can't, oh man, this is terrible, y'all. A few verses up, let me just, I think it's, Yeah, verse 12. In 14 he says, "This is the Israelites talking to Moses. Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." So, man, they've been praying for deliverance. We got our deliver, we go. Man, we're going, we're good. We're celebrating, man, we're having a party. We get to the Red Sea, we can't cross. Why'd you bring us out here? It's just like we told you. We'd have been better off to die in our captivity than to die here. And God comes down and he says, boom, Moses, take your staff, raise it. And the water split. Again, this is not mythology. I'm getting excited. This is not mythology. This is real. The water split. It became like a wall on the right and on the left. And they walked through on dry ground. Okay, so if you want to believe, like, at that point there's a drought, and you kind of got this muddy pond out here that you're going to cross down the hill that everybody sees, the ground's still not dry. Dry ground. Not muddy, not sloshy, not a swamp. Dry ground. Okay, the next time. We get to chapter 15. Okay, hey, and by the way, just if you wanted to know, why'd you bring us out here to die? Then you perform a miracle, we get through it, you get to 15:1, then they spend about 18 verses singing a song. Sound like me. Amen. All right. Water provided. Verse 22 of 15, right? 22 through 26 says, "Then Moses led Israel on from the Red Sea, and they went out to the wilderness of Shur. They journeyed for 3 days in the wilderness without finding water. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water at Marah because it was bitter. That is why it was named Marah." I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. The people grumbled to Moses. Here's what I want you to hear. The people grumbled to Moses. "What are we going to drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he threw it in the water, The water became drinkable. He made a statute and an ordinance for them at Marah, and he tested them there. Interesting. Verse 26 says, he said, if you will carefully obey the Lord your God, do what is right in his eyes, pay attention to his commands, and keep all his statutes, I will not inflict any illness on you. I inflicted on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals. Okay? The Lord who heals. What I want you to see here, right? Journey in the wilderness, 3 days without water. Why are we here? I'm thirsty. What are you going to do? Moses gets some instruction. See the tree? Take the tree, put it in the water. The water's drinkable. God provided. Okay. They needed to depend on him for drink. God delivered drink. Okay. The next one. The next one's manna and quail. Guys, this is a long chapter, and here's what I'm going to encourage you. Go read chapter 16 sometime. I'm going to try to paraphrase it, okay? But here's verses 2 through 3. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into this wilderness to make the whole assembly die of hunger. Man, they sound like a teenage kid. You give them what they want, they get delivered, and then a little bit later, what are you doing? Here we are again. So the story goes. God gave them manna from heaven. He didn't grow a bunch of wheat. He didn't send a bunch of people out and say, mill this up, make flour, cook it, cook just the right amount, store it. He rained manna from heaven. Just enough. He gave them meat. Guess they needed a little protein for their diet. Okay. They were angry, they grumbled, and God provided. You know what's interesting? For 40 years they ate manna. Go to the end of the chapter. Here's what I want you to hear, right? You guys remember the reason they wandered for 40 years? Disobedience. Thank you, Will. You guys should come to Sunday school. Will's got a lot of good stuff, and he's really smart. But between him and Dave and Jim Martzoff, we're studying a lot of these things in Sunday school. So there's my little side pitch. Come to Sunday school. You get some good stuff in there. For 40 years, but they were disobedient. But here's the deal. Even in their disobedience, God provided food for them for 40 years. Is that not grace? Is that not mercy? They grumbled. We could be in Israel, fat, dumb, and happy, sitting by the pot of meat, but you brought us out here to die. I love you. Let me give you some bread. I love you. Let me give you some meat. Let me sustain you, even in your anger. None of you probably like that, right? The last one is water from a rock. Exodus 17. This is good, guys. I'm going to do about 2 more minutes here, and I'm going to take about 10 minutes and actually finish the sermon. Okay? What time do the Steelers play today? You guys got me on the clock, don't you? All right. What time's church start? No, I'm just kidding. I had to do it. I'm sorry. Exodus 17. Verse 2 says, so the people complained to Moses, give us water to drink. Why are you complaining to me? Moses replied to them, why are you testing the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water and grumbled against Moses. They said, why did you ever bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Then Moses goes to the Lord. Here we go again. You guys are getting a pattern, I'm hoping. He goes to the Lord. He says, take that staff that turned into a snake you raised and split the Red Sea. Hit that rock. He hits that rock, and guess what happens? Water. They got water to drink. Here's the deal. We see the life of Moses before God at the burning bush. Right? And God calls him, and eventually God says, that's all I got to say about that. Go. Moses went. Moses went. Then he leads a people. So Moses has got individual independence going on over here. Guys, if anybody comes to you in your front yard in a fiery burning bush and starts claiming that he's God and tells you go stand in front of Barack Obama and say you want to lead some people to freedom, let me ask you if anybody thinks you're crazy. Don't tell me that man was dependent on God. Every fiber of his being was dependent on God. Then he leads a people who are not exercising good dependence on God. So my question to you now becomes, this is kind of the sermon part, okay? So we've got about 10 minutes here. Are you dependent on God? Is the story of Moses and the Israelites just a cool story to you that they show at Easter, of all things? Here's the video clip we ought to show at Easter. The last 10 seconds of the Passion. It's Jesus in the tomb, risen. That's Easter. Not Charlton Heston. That was a side note, sorry. They weren't dependent on him individually. And they didn't exercise that. But don't get hard on them, because what do you worry about? What are you not depending on God for? So I ask Beth a lot of this stuff. Poor Beth, when I'm doing a sermon, that poor woman has to listen to me. Ask question after question. And really, you probably don't want to be around me when I'm preparing for a sermon, because I'll ask you a bunch of questions. It's like informal surveys for Todd, right? So here's some stuff, and this is in my own life, Beth and I's life, and people I talk to. So if I say something on here that you've either shared with me or something, don't feel like I'm thinking of you. I'm not singling you out. This is like just Todd thinking through and meditating on things that I hear people say, I'm dependent on God for this. Or they'll say, God's not answering it. He's not there. I'm getting crickets. Healing? You depend on Him for healing? Do you depend on Him for companionship? That's interesting. College kids, I got to say this. I got a 21-year-old son. At some point in time, he's going to want a spouse. And he's really seeking God's counsel for whom that may be. Stay there, do that. Stay there, do that. Find out and wait on Him. That's so important. We depend on finding companionship, right? We depend on delivery from a difficult job. We depend on help in our personal finances. We depend on marital contentment. Man, that's such a tough one for me. Because there are people close to us, Beth and I, who we've spent a lot of time with, where one really is seeking the Lord and wants to do what the Lord wants and another doesn't. And that's a tough thing. And here's what I'll tell you. Contentment is found in Jesus. I'm not trying to be religious. Here's all I can tell you. It's all I got to give you. That's it. That's it. Parenting guidance, parental care. Man, when you're a parent and you mess up, oh, that's terrible. Especially when they're this big. I can remember one little side story. Erin was out. I was changing the brakes on the car, and I'm really into it, and she's singing. And she's trying to do this vibrato in her singing, and she's like 6, and it's driving me nuts because I can't remember how that spring went. I'm doing this, and I'm looking at that. And I killed her spirit by saying, don't do that now. She's 23. We still talk about that. Ugh. But we depend on God to give us parental guidance and be good parents, don't we? Right? How about in the church? Ministry opportunities, outreach, financial provision in the church, knowing God as a community. We depend on God for worship. Here's one. We depend on the leadership to have direction and take us rightly. they're not perfect. We will mess up. Love us. Because we love you. I'm saying that from the heart. Okay? How about us? What do we grumble and complain about? Man, I'm telling you, Beth and I have had a personal experience in our life with somebody very close. I've grumbled. I've asked God why. I've cried. I've said I don't understand it. I got mad at him. Newsflash, he knows, tell him. Man, if you'll tell him, all you're doing is revealing transparency. I promise you that. It's not new to him. But if you'll go before him with your grumbling and you'll give it to him, he is faithful. And we're still waiting, just so you know. But he is faithful. I'm telling you that. What gets in the way? My opinions, the size of the work. This is too big. I can't deal with it. Selfishness, doubt, worry, my inadequacies, the difficulty of the work, gratifications. The biggie to me is time. We want God to act on our time. We always do that. Okay, I've been given a vision from the Lord. The Lord wants me to do this. And it doesn't happen within 90 days, and where's he at? Moses was 40 when he went to the wilderness. Moses was 80 when he went to Pharaoh. And he lived a long time. Okay? And Moses never saw the promised land. On God's timing. On God's timing. On God's timing. Every time. Every time. Here's some takeaways for you. You still with me? I'm good on time. Not too many heads nodding, so I think we're doing okay. Here we go. Here's some takeaways for you. God understands and gives mercy to our questions. God understands it. If you don't believe me, look at the life of the Israelites going through the wilderness. I didn't read in any of this that I read to you today where he said, I'm tired of your questions, you're done. I'm going to kill you like you deserve. He's fine with your questions. Ask him. I'm telling you now, ask him. Spend time with him, talk to him, and ask him. Lay it down with him. Tell him you don't understand it. Tell him it hurts. Tell him you want an answer right now. He's fine with your questions. They're not bigger than him. He's bigger than you. Second thing, God is patient and he provides forgiveness, mercy, and grace. He meets our needs. One of these days, I hope to preach a sermon or teach a series on grace and mercy, because many times we like to combine those two. You know, mercy is expression in God's favor and understanding. Grace is God's favor, unmerited favor. But grace enables you to overcome and do as he's called you to do, and empowers you with him to do it. Don't argue with me about it. Go to the Apostle Paul. 3 times I asked you to take this away. 3 times. And you said no. And you said no because your grace was sufficient. That if I did it in your power, I would boast on you and not me. The Israelites couldn't split the Red Sea. They couldn't get water from a rock. They couldn't make bitter water clean. And they certainly can't throw up wheat and have bread come down from heaven. He will provide. He gives forgiveness, he gives grace, and he gives mercy. Whatever your struggle is, deliverance. You want deliverance, right? You want deliverance from things. What is it? Deliverance from a bad marriage. Deliverance from a bad job. Deliverance from, I like to eat. Maybe I need deliverance from the carb craving, right? I don't know. Whatever that is, right? You got to go to Him. You got to give it to Him. And you got to depend on His grace to do that, because His grace is sufficient. All right? Obedience increases our dependence. So here's what I'm going to tell you. I asked this question, Will answered it. Why did they wander 40 years? Disobedience. You want to get confidence in Jesus Christ in your life, you be obedient. Okay? Call me legalist, call me direct, call me to the point, whatever you want to call me. I'm telling you, when I'm obedient to Jesus Christ, I have confidence that He is at work and doing what He's supposed to do. When I'm disobedient, gets gray, gets cloudy, questions come. I make changes, not God. Be holy as I am holy. That's from Him. That's not from a legalist. That's not from a mean-spirited God. It's from a God who loves you and will empower you with His grace to accomplish that by being obedient. Be obedient. Be holy. Man, we live in a culture or a society where we want to take culture and we want to dilute obedience. Well, culture today. Guess what? Sexual perversion existed in the Roman Empire. Chemical dependency was not something that came along with Western culture. Read the Proverbs. Be obedient. Know Him. Pursue Him. Man, I'm sorry. I don't mean to yell at you, but I'm telling you, from personal experience, I'm trying to tell you from passion, not from pounding you over the head with a Bible or a cross or anything. When I'm obedient, God is seen. And He delivers, and I know His grace, and He gives me new life in Him. I'm the variable, not Him. Getting excited, lost my place. Understand that dependence leads to our primary calling. I don't have time. But there's several proofs in Scripture of this. The Red Sea, at the result, they feared the Lord and believed in Him. Water provided when He threw the tree in. There was 12 springs and 70 date palms at Elim where they went next. The manna and quail, at the end of that, He says, they will know He is Yahweh, their God. They will know He is Yahweh, their God. Water from a rock, it demonstrated that God was among them. What about Joshua in the Jordan River? At the end of that, the people of the earth may know the hand of the Lord. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What did Nebuchadnezzar say when they were delivered from the fire? Do you guys remember? You know the story? Here's what he said. We all better fall down and worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know why? Because there's no other that can do this but Him. No other. You think your dependency is important? When you depend on Him, when you're obedient to Him and He lives out through you, here's what's going to happen. People around you are going to know that He is God and He is your God. And here's the deal. He's going to give us an opportunity to share that and embrace that. And not be critical of people, but love them the way Jesus loved you. Man. Here's where I want to close this. You can't know. I didn't forget. I wanted to think how I wanted to word that. That's why I did this walk back and forth. You can't know, or you can't give out what you don't know. Sean says that very well. You can't make God known if you don't know Him. You can't depend on Him if you don't know Him. At the end of every day, you got to think, why is God doing what He's doing in my life? It's to make Him known. That's the truth. If it was about getting saved and going home, we'd be home once we're saved. He leads us here for a purpose, to make him known. Guys, I got to confess to you, I don't do that well sometimes. A lot of times, I get busy in my life, man. It becomes all about me and I forget about him. I hope you're honest enough to say that to yourselves. Remember Paul Goddard's definition? It was God's design. Sin's intrusion. And Jesus Christ reconciliation to God for a flourishing human life. A flourishing human life will make him known.